Okay.
Grass.
Great. Thanks. Okay. Appreciate you guys showing up today. Today wasn't supposed to be the best weather that we've had in spring so far. Spring is sprung, as they say. For the younger cavers here who don't know me, I used to be the faculty advisor of the Student Caving Club, your club. Started back in 1977. And it started during times of great turmoil in the 70s when we had controversies. The controversy was that two caver leaders at the time, Chuck Hempel and Bob Custer, disagreed with each other on strategy, grotto strategy, and Bob broke away with his share of cavers from the group to form the WVU Student Grotto, and Chuck took his Mountain State Grotto, of course, down to the Elkins area. And so that's how the Student Grotto basically started in a nutshell. And I was asked to be faculty advisor of the group, and I had been for 38 years until 2015 when Kristen took over and straightened you guys out as faculty advisor. I had a kind of a laissez-faire policy for most things that went on with the grotto, and some stories I would hear about and other stories I wouldn't hear about. In fact, if you invite me back after today sometime, I will tell you about how one student in the grotto met an untimely end. And I threatened to tell this story year after year for decades, and every time I would think of doing this, the current chairperson of the grotto would say, no, Dr. Rauch, don't do that. We don't want to discourage new membership in the grotto. But the person didn't die in a cave. It was another incident. Anyway, that's aside from the story here. So, I was a geology professor before I retired, and I taught a class in caves and karst. And every fall semester, I would take my class down to Schneideker Saltpeter Cave area, and we toured Randolph, Pocahontas, Greenbrier, and Monroe counties to look at the surface karst features, the sinkholes and outcrops and so forth, and some of the caves. And there's at least one person here who's a veteran of that class, Dave Riggs. And I think just one person. So anyway, I would tell this story, half a mile deep, Schneider's Cave, sitting on Story Rock, have our lights turned out. It's Halloween weekend intentionally, not just for the good weather, but to share the stories that were appropriately timed this season. And this was one of the stories. In fact, this was the highlight story I used to tell the class. So I'm sitting in the doctor's office back in October, an hour late for the doctor's appointment. The doctor was an hour late for me, that is. I'm twiddling my thumbs, and I thought I'd get my cell phone out, and I'd start to type this story up. I never typed it up before. So I typed up a couple paragraphs. I sent the story to a good caver friend of mine, Chuck Porter, who's in Troy, New York, and he's the editor of the Northeastern Caver newsletter. He said, I want to see the whole story. So, 3 months later, after abundant additional research, consulting of resources, I typed up the story. It's been published 3 weeks ago in the Northeastern Caver, if you guys want to see it. Has anybody seen the story yet, Northeastern Caver? No one? Okay. And I promised people who couldn't make it tonight, I have a list, that I would send them the whole story from the Northeastern Caver if they couldn't hear this talk tonight. Now, my talk tonight is going to be a summary of what I published in that story. It would take hours, literally hours, to explain the story, so I'm going to try to summarize it as best I can. So this is a story about a West Virginia caver named Peter Hauer. And the information I used, I'm going to use the old-fashioned pointer here. The laser thing doesn't seem to be working anyway. I tried it out earlier today. So I consulted a bunch of people, cavers or former cavers, some of whom you will recognize here. Most of you will recognize Chuck Hempel, is probably the most recognizable person. Jack Speece is a Pennsylvania caver, living in Altoona. Ellen Snyder is my former student and a caver. She lives in Mexico. Keith Kirk, former boyfriend of Ellen's, he lives in, where does he live? I think California. Yeah, he's in California. Roland Vineyards, an upstate New York caver. Dennis Schleifer is a Virginia caver. Chuck Hempel, of course, living in the Elkins area, West Virginia. Ed Schwepston lives in Rodsburg, West Virginia, Greenberg County. Paul Stewart's in New Jersey caver. And Mike and Rosemary live, I think, in North Carolina. But all these people had one thing in common. They were all friends of Peter Hauer. Except for Paul. Paul came along after Peter Hauer's caving career, shall we say. But Paul wrote a remarkable book, which I'll tell you about, dealing with Peter Hauer. In fact, here's the book that Paul wrote. True Tales of Terror in Caves of the World. Raise your hand if you've seen this book. No one's seen this book? Okay, you've seen it, Sean. Okay, there you go. What's the very first chapter, Sean, in the book?
Well, I've never read it or seen it.
Oh, okay, well, true confessions. At least you saw the cover. Okay, that's better than the rest of the people. Okay, so Paul Stewart was inspired to write this book. It took him 2 years to write the book, 2002 to 2004. And he interviewed dozens of people. He got a lot of this information here, not all of it. And if it wasn't for the Peter Hauer story, he probably would not have written his book. He has sold thousands of copies of the book. I have the paperback version, and there's a digital version out there as well. So it's the very first chapter in the book. Peter's obituary had quite a bit of good information, published mysteriously 7 years after he died in 1975. Memorial statements. The British caver even got involved. This was a worldwide caver tragedy story at the time it happened. And, well, if I go on too long, I'll run out of time. Anyway, I got the State Police investigative report through Paul Stewart. He had to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get the story. I'm trying to get a second copy of the story, and they tell me that the Peter Hauer case is still under adjudication or prosecution. In fact, here's the letter I got in the mail just this week. In response to my request for additional information, including crime scene photos. That's what I really wanted, the crime scene photos. So we'll see what happens there. I think there may be a cover-up going on, but we'll see. Last will and testament of Peter Hauer. It's not often that you get the culprit and or the victim of a crime issuing his last will and testament, plus a confession. FBI reports. I consulted courtesy of Roland Vineyard. Paul didn't have those for his book. Various newspaper articles. Inside Detective Magazine even got involved, and there may be a slight possibility of a connection to the murder of the Rainbow Girls in West Virginia in 1980. So that's the introduction to my story. Well, here's Peter. Here's the good, clean-cut image of Peter, probably a high school graduation photo. And this is the hippie-ish image of Peter as he was transitioning to his wilderness, back to the earth lifestyle, as many cavers do. Not all of us, but many of us. And I got these through Jack Speece. He got them from Peter's mother. So the transformation's complete. Here's Peter, obviously wintertime. He's got his wire-rimmed glasses, his long hair, with a couple of his caving buddies. And they're, at this time, in southern Pocahontas County in West Virginia, where he bought a farm. So what's the bio of Peter? Basically, he was born in 1945. He died either on June the 9th or later. We don't know the exact date of his death. It's a mystery, even to this day. This is the kind of story that you might see on a television show, 48 Hours on TV, or you might see in a Netflix movie, a parody movie. He grew up in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, in Pennsylvania Dutch country, south of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, state capital. He moved to Massachusetts in the early 60s, finished high school there. He went to prep school, and then he started a college education, which he finished in Gettysburg. He got his BA degree in biology in the late 60s. He taught in what we used to call a ghetto school, but we're not allowed to use that word anymore, so it's a inner city school in Harrisburg for 5 years. And then he said, I've had it. I want the wilderness life. I'm moving to West Virginia. And meanwhile, he had been caving in West Virginia, so he knew basically where he was headed. He met his girlfriend, Ellen Snyder, in 1971, and they moved to West Virginia in 1973 together. They were a couple together, and then, of course, he died in 1975. What's my connection to Peter? Actually, my connection to Peter is only slight compared to his friends. I met Peter by accident, initially. I was coming out of a cave in upstate New York in the summer of 65 or 66 with a friend, and we were local country boys up there in upstate New York. We didn't come from New York City or any place like that. We're coming out of the cave, and a whole boatload a big carload of cavers were coming in from the Boston Grotto. And Peter was one of the cavers in the Boston Grotto. So we got briefly acquainted at that time. Then about 9 years go by to 1974. I'm a professor at WVU at that time. And who comes in to visit me but Peter and his girlfriend Ellen. And they were both interviewing to become students at WVU. And it turned out Peter never did become a student here, but Ellen did. Ellen went to school. She got her BS degree equivalent in geology, and then she went on to do her master's studies at WVU in geology with me as her advisor. She finally graduated in 1983 after some intervening adventures, shall we say. But I never caved with Peter, per se. Okay. Peter was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in hindsight. He had different personalities that were manifested at different times. So he was a hero on one hand, and he was a villain on the other hand. And what proportion you assign a villain versus a hero depends on your point of view. And you'll see more what I mean later in the story. Okay, so this is the hero portion of the Peter Hauer story. He was a renowned historical speleologist. He spent a lot of time in caves researching saltpeter. And as you know, saltpeter is used to make gunpowder, along with powdered charcoal and powdered sulfur. The ancient Chinese invented this 2,000 or so years ago, gunpowder. And it turns out that saltpeter as an ingredient in gunpowder is a big deal in the history of the United States, because without caves that contain saltpeter, would we have won the Revolutionary War when we did against Great Britain? Probably not, at least not when we did, because of the embargo the British had against us for imported goods, including gunpowder. And also, War of 1812, saltpeter caves were critical. Civil War caves were critical for the South, and the Civil War would not have lasted 4 years if it hadn't been for caves, in my opinion. So Peter, at that time, was the foremost expert on saltpeter caves in the U.S. It was generally agreed among cavers at that time. He published lots of articles Caver's newsletters, bulletins, and so forth. He also published Caves of Massachusetts and Caves of Schoharie County in the upstate New York. So he was well known and so respected that he was awarded fellowship status by the NSS, National Speleological Society, in 1970, and he also won the first James Mitchell Award for outstanding research in 72. He was an ardent conservationist. He belonged to a lot of conservation organizations, including Sierra Club, Isaac Walton League, so on, many organizations. He was so well respected that his reputation lingered after he died, to the extent that we now have the Peter Hauer Award given out annually to the person in the NSS, or really associated scientific organizations, that person who produced the most outstanding spelean history project, usually a publication like a book or a journal article, during the past year. It's given out the annual NSS award conventions. And the NSS took over from another association, sub-association, 1979. There have been 40 awards given out on an annual basis since Peter died. So he's still well respected in the caver community, ironically. Peter's history. Peter bought his Lobelia area farm. If you don't know where Lobelia is, you drive down Route 219 like you're going to Shinnecock Saltpeter Cave, and you drive to the little town of Hillsboro. Turn right at Hillsboro, and you're on Lobelia Road. Follow Lobelia Road about 5 or 10 miles, more like 10 miles, I guess, and you'll get to Lobelia. You'll get to Shinnecock Saltpeter Cave, and before you get to Shinnecock Saltpeter Cave, you'll pass where Peter's farm was along Lobelia Road out of Hillsboro. Lobelia itself is only a few houses along the road. It's not a big deal. He first met Ellen in 71 during a Thanksgiving trip to his farm. His farm was open. It was a caver's field house. Anybody could go there. He was very welcome. And as a result of that, in large part, he met dozens and dozens of West Virginia cavers and made lots and lots of friends, including Ellen in 71. She was so enamored with him, they became boyfriend-girlfriend. And in 73, they moved down from Pennsylvania to the vicinity of Droop Mountain to live on his farm. They were back-to-the-earth people who were subsistence farmers who dealt with leather crafts to sell, trying to make some extra money. They were living off the land. They were vegetarians, animal lovers, and they enjoyed the hippie lifestyle, including, dare I say, recreational drugs. Peter was, I didn't put this in my text story, by the way. This is too sensitive, but since you guys came out, I'll add a few extra facts here. Peter was known to partake in any kind of drug he could find at different times, but he loved the most marijuana. In fact, they tried growing marijuana on their farm, but as Ellen told me recently, they had a hard time trying to grow the weed because the deer would eat it. So can you imagine these deer staggering around the pasture, stoned on the weed, you know? Poor Peter was out there trying to tend his weed garden, so to speak. Again, this is stuff I'm not did not publish in my paper story. Unfortunately, Ellen and Peter broke up around January 1975. This is Peter's farm, 29.5 acres. This is Lobelia Road. You come in from the right, Lobelia, about 4 or 5 miles, you get to his farm, and then you continue just off this map to the left, another half mile or so, you get to the town of Lobelia itself. This figure came from Roland Vineyard, who was a real estate agent. He had access to the real estate maps. This is a satellite image of his farm. This is a topographic map image of the same farm. And this is Lobelia Road again. There's Peter's farmhouse, there's Peter's garage, and various neighbor houses. This one especially has significance later in the story. make a mental image in your mind of the path you would take if you walked from this house across the wilderness, across this ridge, and over here to Peter's house. Keep that in mind for later in the story. Lobelia, again, is just off the map to the left. What did he call his farm? Cave Run Farm, of course. Why did he call it Cave Run Farm? Because this stream right here is Cave Run, ironically enough. He was naturally attracted to buy this land. There's his farmhouse, ordinary looking farmhouse. It was decades old when he bought it. Nice 2-story house, lots of room for partying. And you see a ridge here that's been partially deforested. And if you have a party caver house, you have to have parties, right? And so here's a typical view of one of the parties they had. I'll go back to this figure later and explain who some of these people are, but I'll just explain this person first. This is Patty Mothis. Raise your hand if you've met Patty Mothis. Okay, a couple of people here. Patty is the youngest daughter of Gordon and Ada Mothis. Gordon's deceased, but Ada still owns Friar's Hole Cave. If you go to visit Friar's Hole Cave or any part of it, you better ask Ada Mothis for permission, or her son Robert, who lives over the cave. One of those two. Patty married one of my other geology graduate students. She divorced him after a while, then ran away to Ecuador, living with Peter Hauer, who's an American volcanologist, and they live happily ever after with her second husband. And they monitor volcanoes that are about to erupt in Ecuador. So she's a volcanologist now. I'll say more about this later. Across Cave Run, you see how big Cave Run is. You can jump across it, but you can't drive a vehicle across it unless you're on these planks. And over here is the barn where Peter kept his farm animals. He had goats, he had chickens, he had a horse named April. And they're all in that barn there, at night at least. Looks like a small barn. Well, he bought the land in part because it had caves. And Lobelia Saltpeter Cave is right up there. I've never been in the cave, I have to admit. But the cave drains water over here, and you look closely, somewhere up here there's a waterfall, maybe it's here, and that water drains from another exit to the cave over here and feeds into Cave Run. And this cave is about 200 meters south of Peter's farmhouse. This is the western half of Lobelia Saltpeter Cave. The cave's been surveyed by the Pittsburgh Grotto back in '92. This is published in the WVAS publication 10, Caves of Southern Pocahontas County. I stole it from there. Couldn't get the whole cave map in one figure, so I just scanned half of it. I'll explain what this red X means later. You can probably guess what that means. Here's the cave entrance that we saw on the previous photo. And so the farmhouse is up this way, that direction. There's Peter again. He's in one of his farm vehicles. This is his farm truck. He lugs stuff around at his farm. This is Peter at one of his favorite places, the haunted house on Droop Mountain. And you can see it's an abandoned old farmhouse. This is one of his buddies. Figure caption explains who these people are. This is Peter in a relaxed mood, mellowed out, I'm sure, at this point in time. And he's holding one of his pets. It's too bad Ryan Mauer's not here tonight. Ryan would especially appreciate this picture, I think. He's the snake handler in the Student Grotto. One of the snake handlers, at least. And he loved animals. As they said, he couldn't kill an animal. Whenever he had to harvest the chicken, he would have somebody else come and kill the chicken for him. That kind of thing. So he's a very gentle person who loved the animals. Here he is with another snake, and he's standing in front of the entrance to Saltpeter Cave. And those of you who've been to the cave recognize these boards here the fence you have to hop over to get into the cave. You go back here 100 feet, you turn to the left, and then you're in the big part of the cave. By the way, if you guys have any questions, just, jump right in, okay? Well, here's another image of Peter, the beast man, okay? And Peter has a snarl on his face, and he's looking at us, and he's saying, ha, 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 I know the whole story, but you don't, okay, so to speak. So how did he get this way? Well, they just came out of a sauna party. It was in a sauna, and it was at a local commune. There were communes in the area, cavers and non-cavers, and very strange things happened in these communes. Okay, back to the party picture again. So why did they have this party? They were getting together for a wedding. Who was getting married? Peter and Ellen. Ellen Snyder right here in the red top. People are standing around, and it looks like they could be happier, right? You don't see many smiles on their faces. Well, what happened here? What happened was the wedding got interrupted, permanently interrupted. A few hours before the wedding time was to take place, on a certain day in October 1973, Peter got a call from his mother who had a medical distress event. So he had to drop everything, go up to Pennsylvania, visit with his mother. But the cavers were all there, and they said, well, let's continue with the party. Why ruin our situation here because of an unexpected turn of events? So they had a party. This woman was to be her best woman, best bridesmaid. This is Ellen's mother. This is Ellen's father, who looks like kind of hippie dude here. He was a dentist in Connecticut. She was a real estate agent in Connecticut. And there's Patty Mathis again. And this is somebody, well, the name's down here anyway. Don't worry about the name. Same time, same party. This date is an error. It should be 73 instead of 74, and I will correct that. This is Ellen standing beside, proudly, she is smiling here because she is proud of her wedding cake. And her wedding cake was a carrot cake made by a neighbor lady. And the carrot cake has chrysanthemum flowers decorating it around the edges. So they had a good time. Anyway, this is the other fateful person in my story, Walter Smith. Apologize for the quality of the photo, but this is a high school photo that was reprinted in a newspaper, scanned from the newspaper for this presentation in my publication. Walter Smith was a young man, 19 years old. He was a WVU forestry major. He was from Fallsby, West Virginia, near Weirton, Northern Panhandle. He was down at Watauga State Park working on a summer job. The summer job was as a counselor at the park, and he was a lifeguard at the pool, local pool in the park. And his father was William Smith, who was the CEO of Weirton Steel, and his father was a good friend of Governor Rauch, our only three-term governor in West Virginia. And Rauch was an infamous governor who was investigated for corrupt racketeering activities and found guilty and sentenced to jail. Okay. I could tell you more stories about Rauch over a beer sometime, but anyway. So this is Walter. The story of Walter. The unfortunate end of Walter. Walter had a bicycle, and he liked to go on bicycle trips on the weekend when he wasn't working at the park. This is summer of 74, and in particular, summer of 75. So he went away on a bicycle trip on June 4th. He never returned. What happened to Walter is the question. Well, police investigation ensued. His parents got worried. Various friends of his got worried. His roommate at the park got worried. And the superintendent of the park got worried. And they all started searching calling out for Walter. Then we jump from June the 4th to June 11th, 1 week later. It took the authorities a whole week to find Walter. What happened to Walter? Well, there was a confession note found on Peter's kitchen table that had been typed up by a typewriter Peter had in the house. And he signed this document. It was a last will and testament with an attached confession, 2-page typed document, which has remained hidden from the public as part of the general police report that the police did not hand out. I got a copy of it, by serendipity, I got a copy of it. In the document, Peter supposedly confesses to the murder of Walter and where his body can be found in a cave, Lobelia Saltpeter Cave, behind his house. So, Ed Schwepston, who's a current caver, and I met him just last August at the Old Timers Reunion. I happened to be standing at the right place at the right time. If it wasn't for me being at Old Timers Reunion last August, this story would have been far different. So Bill Balfour introduces me to Ed Schwepston, and Bill said, Ed is a famous caver. How is he famous? Well, he's done a lot of things with caves, but he's most famous for finding the body of Walter Smith. We'll skip this one. This is in my written story explaining why we have strange markings on this document. This is the confession document, believe it or not. This is a copy of a copy of a copy of the confession document. The original document was typed on 2 sides of the same piece of paper. But when the police photocopied it, they did a poor job, and they left these various streaks and marks and stuff like that. So how did I get it? Well, Peter Hauer's sister, Lisa Hauer, got it from the police. They gave her anything she wanted from the crime report. So she wrote these notes in blue ink here. I added the sticky notes. Anyway, the document describes all his possessions and who was to get what possession of his. So his last will and testament. But the second part of the document, starting about here, talks about his so-called confession. Either it's a real confession and he murdered Walter Smith, or somebody forced Peter to type this document and murdered Walter Smith, and then kidnapped Peter, framed him for the murder of Walter Smith, and later did away with Peter. So there's 2 broad theories. There's 2 broad theories with variations about what really happened. So this is the confession document. His last girlfriend was Rin Agnew. She has not volunteered, shall we say, any information for my story. She's a Baltimore area caver. He wanted to give Rin all his money, $1,800 left in his checking account. But it went to Ellen instead, because she was co-owner of the checking account. Anyway, I know you can't read this stuff, but it's just to show you that the document exists, and I'm proud to have it. Key statements from the document. Okay, so Peter had various implicating statements that he made. And anything in quotes here is what he said. I picked directly off the document and did not paraphrase it. Okay? He said Walter was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said he did not suffer. This is a message to Walter's parents. What the heck does that mean? He is buried on the west side of the cave, Lobelia Saltpeter Cave. And then Peter admitted that he is mentally sick, even over years. Well, it turns out that Peter's sister, Lisa, was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis or bipolar disorder. And so the implication is that Peter had the same mental illness. Okay. And I know that from conversations she had with another caver who gave me this information. And probably the most startling statement he made in the confession document was that fantasy of the evil kind has become my reality. Gulp. What does that mean? I take my own life. I remove myself from this reality. My body will eventually be found in a cave in the nearby hills. What the heck? The cavers spent hundreds of hours looking for Peter in a cave. They never found him in a cave. He was found somewhere else, which I'll explain a little bit later. So he threw a red herring at his caver friends by even saying this. Or maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he was going to commit suicide in a cave, but then decided to do something else. And this statement is interesting. And could he be talking to us from the grave with this statement here? This was designed for his parent, for his mother. His father had been deceased, for his mother and his sister, but he could be talking to us here. He said, I fear not death. We will meet again in the eternal form, encompassing all things past and present, as one consciousness, neither heaven nor hell. So will we see Peter again, is the question. At least those of us who knew him, will we see him again? Okay, back to the map of the cave. There's where they found Peter. And as I said, Ed Schwepston found him right there. And I only heard this story last August. That happened because Bill Balfour and Ed were standing right next to me by coincidence. He was found right there within 10 meters of the spot. There's a scale bar over there. How did Ed find him? Is the question. Well, he used the principle of forensic geology. And the people who are familiar with these caves know that the cave floors often have breakdown. They have pebbles, cobbles, and boulders falling from the ceiling and the walls of the cave. And on the tops of those rocks is typically a black manganese dioxide coating. And after we leave this room, if you're interested, I'll show you the black manganese dioxide coating on the wall of Brooks Hall on a rock that's just only 100 feet in this direction. Okay, so Ed knew to look for that black manganese coating because those rocks had not been disturbed. But right here, the rocks had been disturbed because the black manganese coating was not on the top of those rocks. The rocks had been disturbed by human presence. He started digging at this spot and found the bare feet of Walter. Then more scrambling and more digging, removal of rocks showed the bare legs of Walter. And then they uncovered his whole body, and Walter was nude. And they found various things. They found wire around his neck. They found a rope around his midriff. They had plastic tarp around his body, a piece of wool blanket around his head. The piece of wool blanket had been torn off of a blanket that Peter had in his house from a college in Massachusetts. It was engraved with the name of the college. And Peter was shot once in the neck and twice in the forehead above each eyebrow. And the police figured the shots in the forehead are what actually killed him. The shot in the neck made him unconscious. This is what the police report says. And he was violated prior to the murder, sexually assaulted, according to the pathology report. Here's the spot where they dug him up, right here. This is Lobelia Saltpeter Cave. This is from a photograph taken by a newspaper, published here. Here's Ed Schwepston as a young man. And these are 3 other conservation officers present with him in the cave, posing for the newspaper. Where is Walter Smith now? I Googled him. Where did he show up? In the Find a Grave website. If you do genealogy research, you can find your ancestors and their buried graves. And there he is. If you want to visit him, drive down I-79 to Flatwoods, get off at the Flatwood Cemetery, and that's where he is. I don't know why they buried him in the Flatwood Cemetery. Who knows? Now the second half of the story begins. What happened to Peter? Peter's on the lam. He was last seen tending his garden. He was weeding his garden. He had written 3 letters to various friends of his for future activities he intended to interact with them about. So he had planned out his schedule days, if not weeks, in advance. He was tending his garden. You don't tend your garden unless you're going to plan to harvest the vegetables, right? Why would you spend wasting time weeding if you're not going to make use of the produce in the garden? He was seen in his garden shortly before noon on June the 5th, June the 9th. Then, mysteriously, the lights were left on in his house. The back door was left open, wide open, for 3 days. Finally, the police came and investigated, and on June 11th, they found a typewritten confession in his house. And I told you that story already. And then the massive manhunt began, and Ed Schwepston and Chuck Hempel led the cavers in searching for Peter Hauer. Either they were looking for a body, or they were looking for him hiding out somewhere after he committed the murder. Something happened, and they were looking for him. And then there was this mysterious group called the Freundschaft. And the Freundschaft may have been a commune of cavers. I don't know. But this is mentioned in a letter by Bobby Nagy. Anybody here know Bobby Nagy? Nobody knows Bobby Nagy. Okay, she lived in Franklin, West Virginia for a long time, Pendleton County. She moved to Mexico, and mysteriously, she died by suicide by train. She was decapitated by a train. Strange event. Ellen Snyder confirmed that it was suicide and not being murdered by train. And I have letters from Bobby Nagy that describe this tragedy. Anyway, the state police realized they weren't going to find Peter. He wasn't in any cave. And so they called in the FBI on June 17th. And the FBI led a massive, mammoth, nationwide search for Peter, even extending as far as Washington, Oregon, and California. It was nationwide, through dozens of offices. And I have most of the interview reports from the FBI. So here's the FBI describing the search for Peter. Fugitive, long hair, beard, 5'10", 160 pounds, green eyes, glasses, and most of all, armed and dangerous. This guy's giving caving a bad reputation, you know. Anyway, so dozens of agents searched for him nationwide, and I was interviewed in June of '75 by an FBI agent from Fairmont, nearby. And as 4 examples I pulled out the FBI reports, there were these 4 people, among others, were interviewed. And I'll just tell you about this guy here, Keith Kirk, who was Ellen's boyfriend after Peter. Here's a picture of Keith Kirk with his banjo. Does this remind you of something? Deliverance, maybe? Movie Deliverance. He's here touring in West Virginia, having a good time with a friend of his. And this is in '73. Little does Peter know in 1973 what's about to happen to him in 1975. So he's up in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, which is near Pittsburgh. And he gets interviewed, shall we say, by the FBI, along with the Ambridge Police Department. What is he doing when he's contacted by the police? He's in a pool of water. A pool of water. Well, let me back up for a second. He has some facial similarities to Peter Hauer. He's got a beard. He has the same color hair. He got the wire-rimmed glasses, the same height, the same body build. Superficially, if someone didn't know any better, they might think, maybe he's the fugitive Peter. And so the Ambridge police were prepared to capture him thinking that he was Peter, even though Ellen told him differently. So he's doing a kayak roll in Big Swickley Creek near Pittsburgh. He's doing a kayak roll. He's demonstrating to area kids how to roll a kayak underwater and back to the surface again. And When he pops up to the surface on one of the rolls, the police, Ambridge police, had been hiding behind bushes and trees with rifles and guns. This is a real story. Ellen told me this personally, so this is firsthand to her and secondhand to me. They pop up and they said, "Get out of the water now." He looks around and says, "What?" They yanked him out of the water. He couldn't dry himself. He was dripping wet. They hauled him off in the police car. As one of the cops threw his gun into the back of the car in the trunk, the gun goes off. He didn't have the safety on. Bam! Keith thought, my God, am I going to survive this experience? I'm innocent. And they take him to the police station. They hold the gun to his head as they interview him. And they're trying to get him to confess that he's Peter. He said, "No, my identification says I'm Keith." Finally, the FBI had to call the Ambridge police and say, "You had the wrong guy, let him go." And they finally let him go. But they said, "Don't leave town." The very next morning, he left town. He went to Michigan on a business trip. I don't think the police ever found out. Anyway, this is all in my published story. That's just one of the stories of the FBI. Okay, paranoia and hysteria reign in this area. I don't have time to get into all of this, but torture and killing of Peter's farm animals. Did I tell you about that? I don't think so. It turns out that late one night, Peter hears this bawling, screaming noise coming from his barn. He says, "What the heck is that?" So early the next morning, he gets up. He walks across the bridge. And he enters the barn. In the barn, he found 2 slaughtered goats. They had been tortured, mutilated, and killed. Not necessarily, well, maybe killed, mutilated, whatever. Anyway, 2 slaughtered goats in the barn. And this was like about October 74. Then, in another incident, his horse got tortured. His horse, April, got tortured. I'll spare you about how he got tortured. Then, in December of 74, before Christmas, snow was on the ground, and they found the horse killed. The horse had recovered from torture and killed a few weeks later. So Peter and Keith Kirk followed the tracks in the snow from the barn after the last incident. And they followed them across the ridge to Boyd Thompson's property. And Boyd Thompson was renting his house out to a hillbilly family that Peter described as being straight out of the movie Deliverance. This family didn't like the outsider hippies moving in to the valley areas around them. And they had I used to describe him as a retarded son, but Bob Griffith explained I wasn't allowed to use that term anymore, retarded. So he was the mentally deficient 21-year-old son of this hillbilly family that rented the farm from Boyd Thompson. And they got him to confess to the torture and killings of the animals, and he was sentenced to 6 months in the Weston Penitentiary, the mental institution in Weston, West Virginia. Peter, meanwhile, was scared to death because he thought, this guy's going to get out eventually. Maybe he'll get out on parole or something. So he acquired a gun, a .25 caliber pistol. And so he acquired the gun, and he kept the gun on his person, and he even slept outside on the ground because he was afraid about being ambushed in his house at night. During warm summer nights, he slept outside. At this time, well, after Peter disappeared and they hadn't found him yet, cavers were suspicious of other cavers. And this is something I didn't know about, Dave, when I taught you the Cars class before. I told you that story. I have letters from cavers who were suspicious of and accusing other cavers of covering up the crime scenes, either with Walter Smith or with Peter. and covering up evidence, and maybe even being involved in some of the murders. And one caver, who remained anonymous even after I drank several beers, he told me that he was lucky to be alive and survive the ordeal, that he wasn't falsely imprisoned from accusations made by other cavers at the time, which he didn't fully realize till I communicated with him only a few months ago. There were rumors of communes, cults, and covens of witches in the area, Wiccan-type witches. And there's some evidence for that. Chuck Hempel ran into a Wiccan witch who said that Peter could be found held captive in a barn or a hut. And so the cavers searched all the barns and huts in the area, and they didn't find him. And Walter Smith himself was associated with one of the cults containing at least one witch. According to the state police, they had a physical relationship. You know what that means. And she was married to another guy at the time. And so one of the suspects, if you believe a third party committed the murders, not Peter, was that maybe this woman's husband was jealous and committed the murder of Walter Smith. We don't know that, but and police exonerated her later. There was a fear among cavers that Peter was kidnapped, was innocent and kidnapped and about to be sacrificed, either during the next new moon, the next full moon, or the summer solstice coming up in June. And guess what? When Peter disappeared, it was the exact day of the new moon on that month. I checked it on the astronomical charts up by the internet. So I add that to my story. So could that be a coincidence? Maybe not. There were mysterious Lobelia area residents and houses that Ed Schwepston told me about. Ed was with the state police the first time they interviewed the neighbors. And they discovered another witch's house. The lights were on in the house. Hot food was set on the table. There was a fire going in the wood stove, but no one was home. The police knocked on the door. Strange. They went to the backyard. They found a cave in the backyard, a large room. In the room was a temple, an altar on the side of the room with candles. And there was a pentagram on the floor of the cave with candles at the points of the pentagram. Now, in my published story, I said the candles were lit, but Ed corrected me. No, the candles were not lit when he was in the cave and saw the pentagram. There was, I told you about the mean hillbilly family, Deliverance type. And there was another event that happened down here. The Walton family, a neighbor, got scared. They thought their son who came home late, they thought he had been kidnapped and killed by the same witches or whatever that killed Walter. But it turned out he was okay. Peter's found. What happened? 4.5 months go by, they're searching for Peter. They looked in every cave, every pit in the ground, every hill and hollow. And it took deer hunting season to find him. On Thanksgiving Day, November 27th, Peter's body was found by two hunters, a father and son. They had stopped by this one maple tree to eat their lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, about. And the young boy looked up in the tree. I can imagine his jaw opening up wider than it took to eat the sandwich, because up in the tree was a rope hanging 30 feet or more above the ground. At the end of the rope was a noose. In the noose was a blackened head and upper spine of a body. And the body turned out to be Peter. Pathological analysis by the head pathologist in Charleston proved it was Peter from his denture work, shape of the skull. So Peter had been hanged in the tree. Did he hang himself, or did somebody murder him by hanging him in the tree? We know he died from hanging. It was a gruesome scene. And the weird thing was, besides being hanged, was that his right leg was broken in 2 places. 2 bones were broken in his right leg, probably his fibula and tibia. And his skull appeared to be mutilated. It looked like there was a bullet hole in his head. State police, one of the cavers said, bullet hole in the head. The cop that was on the scene said, no, woodpecker pecked a hole in his head. and the state pathologist said, no, it's none of those. It's just a normal growth pattern in the skull. But at the time, it was adding to the hysteria of people in the area. So how did Peter die in this tree? That's a question. Aftermath of Peter's discovery. Okay, they went through burial ceremonies. They took his ashes up to a pre-dug hole on the hillside of Peter's farm, dumped his ashes in. Each caver picked up a rock and put it on top of the ashes. Then his mother erected a granite monument both on the farm, near the burial hole, and also in the Lebanon Valley Cemetery. And there's his monument from Find a Grave website again. Very Spartan caption on the gravestone, by the way. That's a little strange. Okay, so to summarize, the overall theory is either murder-suicide took place or a double murder took place. And in my story, I don't express my own opinion. I leave it to the reader to decide. And you can decide for yourself what really happened here. It adds to the mystery of the story. So, Peter, what happened? Can you tell us? No, you can't speak to us anymore. So, you might think, well, after hearing this story, I want to go down and see this site, right? Be a tourist attraction, at least for cavers. But if you drive down Lobelia Road and you look for this house, you will not find it. What happened to the house? It burned down in 1998. Why did it burn down? Well, the house was sold by Peter's estate to this couple, Marshall Fausold and his wife. I don't know his wife's first name. And they got divorced immediately thereafter. Mrs. Fausold continued to live in the house. When she supposedly was doing the laundry, and dryer lint in the dryer caught fire when she stepped out of the house for a few minutes. She came back to the house was on fire. So the house burned down. That's the official story of how the house burned. So the Fausolds sold the estate to the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, which together with the West Virginia Cave Conservancy now runs Peter Hauer's farm as a cave preserve, with Lobelia Salt Cave, Peter Cave, and other caves in the area. And this is the head guy who's the manager right now, West Virginia Caver. And this is the last slide. Mysteries in Pocahontas County. If you want some exciting, at least mental adventures, if not physical adventures, go down to Pocahontas County. The setting for the Walter Smith and Peter Hauer case, but there are other cases. Dallas McKeever. Who here has heard of Dallas McKeever? Nobody's heard of Dallas McKeever. Well, he died in 1976. On New Year's Day, he was found dead. He had a caver's field house in Swago Creek. He owned Carpenter's Pit Cave and Swago Pit Cave. And they last saw him on New Year's Eve. When the cavers went to knock on his door to stay at his house to do a caving trip, they found him dead inside his door with his throat slashed 3 times. If you're going to commit suicide, would you slash your throat 3 times? I don't know how likely that is. So, the controversy here, was it suicide or was it murder? This case is still officially open. The state police are still investigating this case. And I can tell you more about this over a beer sometime. There's another new case going on right now, at this moment. Steve Kite, a faculty member in my department in geology, is doing research on an ice cave called Herbert Hill No. 2 Cave. And it's in the upper part of the Greenboro limestone, the same as Schneiker Saltpeter Cave. And they called him up to see if he knew anything about a murder victim buried in his cave. The Cave's only about 100, 150 feet long. It's full of alluvial stream sediments. It would be an ideal place to bury a body. And I looked up the cave map of this cave in caves of southern Pocahontas County. The cave has been mapped. And the rumor is the state police were looking for cavers to help search for the body in the cave.
You need to check the WVAC's logbooks. They stopped by WVAC on the weekend.
Did they really?
There was a TV show on Discovery called Appalachian Outlaws, which was about ginseng hunters.
Yeah.
It was 2014, ended early 2015. And one of the main people in it was this young kid that owned some land on Lobelia Road.
Really?
And he's the guy the state police believe did the murder.
Oh, he's the suspect or the victim?
No, he's the suspect.
He's the suspect.
They really believe he did it.
Oh my gosh. That's why they were checking out this cave.
What?
This
People
cave.
they believe killed him.
Yeah, this is along Lobelia Road, yes.
Yeah.
This cave, not far from Peter's farm. And then there's the Rainbow Girls murder. The person who murdered the Rainbow Girls, they were hippies coming to a convention, Back to the Earth, Peacenik people back in 1980. And they camped out in the Monongahela National Forest in Pocahontas County. Two women who were hitchhiking to that event were kidnapped, taken up to Briary Knob, and murdered. And there's a guy named Jacob Beard who lives very close to Lobelia. And there's a little town called Beard. I'm sure it's named after his family. And long story short, he was tried, convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison. But then he was suddenly exonerated because another guy they caught in Missouri, a multiple serial killer, confessed to the murders. But the police think that this second confession was simply inadvertent, that the guy was going to be executed anyway, and why not confess to a few extra murders? He seemed pretty flippant when he confessed to the murders, okay? And so to this day, there are retired cops who think that Jacob Beard murdered the Rainbow Girls, and he also was kind of a mean neighbor type, and he resented the hippie people moving in to the Lobelia area. The probability of him involved in the Peter Hauer case is very remote, but nonetheless, I thought I'd mention it. So that's my story. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Yeah, Kristen.
Is the story going to be published elsewhere? So we want to...
Yes, good point. It's going to be published. George Dasher promised me he would publish a short version of this article in the West Virginia Caver in June, the June issue. And I talked to the Journal of Spelean History editor, and they're thinking of publishing it as an actual journal article. So we'll see what happens. Should be interesting. And I'm going to get a copyright of the story. I haven't yet, just in case someday it might be on TV or whatever. Okay?
I think it'd be perfect Netflix.
Yeah, it would be perfect. Perfect for Netflix.
Especially with all the communes and everything else going in that area.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Weird stuff in that area.
Oh, and there's more stuff. I'll just say one more thing, and that is that for me the story is not quite over yet. I'm looking for the hanging tree. Where is this tree that Peter was hanging? And so I have a posse of people, cavers, who want to go out with me and we'll search for this tree so we can get a photograph of it. Okay? But there's only so many witnesses that are still alive who were at that tree. And I talked to one guy who was in the ambulance from the funeral home of Marlinton, which is in Pocahontas County, same county. And he remembers going there, but he doesn't remember exactly how to get to the tree. He got me close though. I have a topographic map. Peter's house is down here, and he thinks Peter's hanging tree is right up here, about a mile away from the house, north of the house. So we're going to search. There's the son I told you about, the 11-year-old son of the father that was hunting for the deer and found Peter in a tree. Okay, Larkin Dean is his name. He knows better than anyone who's still alive where this tree is. But I talked to the editor of the Pocahontas Times newspaper in Marlinton, and she actually, a reporter working under her named Cindy, actually called up for this guy Dean to find out if he could lead her to the tree. And she talked to his girlfriend, and his girlfriend said, no, the Deans don't want to talk to anyone. They're still traumatized by this story 43 years later, and they don't want to have anything to do with the public related to the story. So they know where the tree is, but will they show anyone else the tree? So I'm looking for someone else to take us to the tree. We'll see. Maybe find a retired cop or something. So that's it. Thank you.
So I think we know where the next student grotto trip is
Yeah.
going.